Your parents literally plagiarized your childhood.
No, they improved upon it and then peddled it to the masses.
I thought you were going to wear white to match the wedding theme.
I thought that'd be creepy.
When Gone Girl released in 2014, a lot of viewers saw Amy's character as implausible, even too extreme to be real. But perhaps it wasn't, because within a decade, Amazing Amy came to life in a Silicon Valley courtroom.
Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes, once a rising star in the tech startup world, now convicted criminal facing 11 years in prison for defrauding investors.
Elizabeth Holmes, a biotechnology entrepreneur, was found guilty of defrauding investors through her blood testing company, Theranos. Similar to the character of Amazing Amy, Elizabeth also came from a family that demanded high achievement, status, and honor. While Amy ended up with a bad marriage, Elizabeth, on the other hand, ended up with a multi-million-dollar fraud and imprisonment. But what really brought them to this place was the pressure to perform, to impress, to embody an ideal that was never truly theirs to begin with. Amy had Amazing Amy, while Elizabeth merged her identity with that of a genius founder. And in doing so, they stopped being people. They became performers. They gave up their true identity in chasing someone else's original self. Originality that felt empowering, for theirs were already distorted since childhood. This is where we enter the idea of idolized originality, which is nothing but an illusion of feeling original by imitating an ideal. But why do people do so? Only because they could not develop their own identity? Yes, but why couldn't they develop their identity? Because they followed someone else? And why is that? Because they couldn't develop their own self? I have seen this philosophical recursion play out in many intellectual discussions. It ends nowhere because the solution in the end often sounds like a problem. But with this video, I'm trying to end this loop forever. This video will go beyond the narrative of being yourself to reveal an obscure truth, a flaw that grows within us as a part of our own existence, while we look for healing and peace in this futile circular argument. The real reason that allows idolized originality to sustain in our minds in the first place. So without further ado, let's begin. When it comes to idolization, there are two tendencies at play: macrocosmic idolization and microcosmic idolization. Macrocosmic idolization is the big picture influences like parents, culture, and societal expectations that shape who we think we should be. Microcosmic idolization, on the other hand, is the subtle, everyday mental habits and the framework that shape how we think and act without us realizing it. What Elizabeth demonstrated is macrocosmic idolization. Macrocosmic idolization of someone famous or a phantom may come from conditioning from high-achieving parents, often with narcissistic traits. Amy's parents in the movie were portrayed as narcissistic, and while nothing of that sort is known of Elizabeth's parent, the fact that they had high expectations of Elizabeth is well established in the media. It is possible that her parents projected their ambitions into Elizabeth from an early age, an age when children are really soaking in all the experiences in the world while exhibiting pure creativity. But parents setting idols and benchmarks attacks their vivid imaginations. Soon, the curious questions are replaced by the idea of success, stardom, and grandeur. The game of looking outside begins, a game no children ever wanted to play. Despite everything, the idea of becoming like someone else takes the center stage. Their creativity is killed, and looking outside becomes the norm as time goes by. One thing to note about macrocosmic idolization is the fact that it is centered around following an individual, because after all, it is easy to relate to a real person. But the motivation of following someone goes beyond their style, charisma, and other surface level stuff. It is rooted in their way of being, their logic, and their internal rhythm.
An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not three separate devices. This is one device.
These aren't just traits, they are an entire cognitive framework, and the more you internalize that framework, the more it begins to shape not just your thoughts, but your habits, your instincts, even your sense of self. This is where we enter the territory of microcosmic idolization. Microcosmic idolization is the invisible script running inside our minds, our ingrained ways of thinking, problem solving, and behaving that feel natural but actually limit our originality. This is what leads to the rigid mindset of this is how it is done. Schools do this at an unprecedented scale to kids. It is far lethal than macrocosmic idolization because the macrocosmic tendencies can be overcome by the dark night of the soul. But that does not apply to the microcosmic factors. They are distorted since childhood through theorems, rubrics, curriculum, and tests at the cognitive level. A popular example that illustrates this phenomenon is this TikTok video. People who watched this video for the first time invariably connected the shape of the hole to the shape of the object. Perhaps you must have done the same as well.
Which spot that goes in?
The square.
That's right, it goes in the square hole. A cylinder,
The circle.
I think that goes in
The circle.
the square hole. Do you see a slot that would fit
The semicircle.
semicircle?
The semicircle.
That's right, it's the square hole.
By putting all the shapes into the square hole, the teacher not only played with our minds but also revealed our inherent tendency of idolization at a subconscious level. What could have been easier and convenient is demonstrated by the teacher. But people just referred to their cognitive programming at the basic level and did what they thought was easiest. In psychology, we call it heuristics, mental shortcuts used by the brain to quickly process information. On one hand, it tends to quickly connect the dots, but on the flip side, can also limit creative subversion or divergent thinking. And this is what happens when it comes to microcosmic factors. Logic, guiding principle, frameworks, they all have the same paradox, and the classroom isn't the only place this paradox plays out. Computers and smartphone UI, technically known as GUI, are also based on heuristics and other cognitive cues. It is due to these elements we get used to the interface. Yes, it is ironic that the microcosmic idolization of the classroom limits our thinking, but the GUI that is based on the same microcosmic idolization augments our behavior when using a computer or smartphone. However, if you look at both of them from a logical point of view, they are both cases of delusion. One is helping us use a device, while the other is conditioning our brain towards repeating patterns. Almost all of us fall for these patterns, but geniuses don't. They can pivot them. Geniuses like Steve Jobs, who, for the same reason, end up being idolized at the microcosmic level. The current GUI of computers wasn't the standard back in 60s and 70s. In those days, everyone interacted with computers through command line inputs. Yes, those black screens with grey text that appear terrifying to the current generation. But similar to the GUI of today, command line inputs using the keyboard was the default microcosmic pattern back then. People who could use it felt like computer overlords. No wonder that engineers who used to swear by the technology idolized it at a microcosmic level. They refuted the argument that GUI could be any better than command line inputs. However, once Steve Jobs discovered the research at Xerox, he proved the scientists wrong by making computers accessible to everyone. Steve Jobs just knew enough about computers that on one hand he could envision things of technical nature, but on the other could also stay clear of the microcosmic idolization. Jobs could not have built the GUI had he idolized command line inputs in the same way engineers did back then. It almost seemed like Jobs took each day at a time and only thought of what he wanted to invent. Jobs dropped out of the college and pursued calligraphy, spirituality, and aesthetics, which finally culminated into building Apple. All of this for what he liked doing. It looks like all the time what he thought about was the next moment and how he is going to spend it to further his pursuit. Even in college, he attended only the classes that he liked. Had he chosen some command line engineer as his idol, he could have become a computer engineer himself, but at the cost of drowning into microcosmic idolization. Another name we could include here is that of Hans Zimmer. Hans carved out his path through a rare mix of instinct, fearless experimentation, and a knack for seizing the right opportunities at the right time. Hans is self-taught, but that is not due to lack of money, unlike Jobs. Hans taught himself because of his unwillingness to bear the torture of conventional learning. His self-taught background gives his work a certain boldness that makes his music stand out from the rest. Similar to Jobs' limited know-how of technology, Hans's limited knowledge of music theory perhaps gave him the space to leapfrog the typical melody, harmony, and counterpoint approach. For most, Hans orients his work from sound design. In other words, he can freely think from emotions and not from theoretical construction of music. It is pretty similar to Jobs, who would keep the human experience at front and then orient his vision from there using his technical knowledge as a mere tool. Both had limited knowledge to a point where they could dodge the microcosmic conditioning and the ego trap it brought along. The ego of idolizing originality, of believing that mastery comes from perfectly imitating a system or a genius before you. This is where we come full circle about idolization of both tendencies. But more importantly, we learn how the microcosmic tendency is the real culprit because of its inanimate and non-personal nature, unlike the microcosmic idolization. Unlike macrocosmic idolization, it does not make for interesting headlines or movies, which makes it go unnoticed most of the time. As soon as the person comes to face the reality that their lives are fragmented at a cognitive level, they realize that the process of reintegration is going to be difficult. This is because changes must be done at a cognitive level. If someone emulated someone's routine that did not fit their energy and values, it must be changed. If someone followed their siblings to a point that influenced the individual's mannerisms, their approach to solve problems, and ways to deal with emotions, it must be changed. It is like inventing a different person altogether, and that is terrifying. People do get this realization from time to time that their lives are not authentic. But because most are so distorted and fragmented that all they do is to hold on to their idols more firmly than ever. Elizabeth did so, and so do hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. I mean, just look around. People are searching for Steve Jobs' schedule, his vision, his rituals, his spiritual retreats, and everything else. But what they are really searching is predictability as a coping mechanism to deal with this truth. It is there to make their aspiration as deterministic as possible. For anyone wanting to get out of this cycle, they must focus on a simple idea. When you cling to a subject, a framework, or anything of microcosmic nature, mostly you're doing it for your ego. And if you're idolizing and clinging onto something of macrocosmic nature, you're doing it to feel safe or avoid shame. True integration to our real self can only happen when we overcome both. First, attack the conditioning you inherited from microcosmic idolization. Ask this question: when was the last time I felt truly like myself, which really energized me without anyone seeing me doing that? Something that made me feel like myself and not someone else. Being able to answer this question solves a large part of the problem, because this is what your mind-body likes doing. This task is something integrated deeply into you, done over a period of time, and it will start feeling effortless. Over a few years, you will start ridding your old conditioning. The second part is overcoming idolization that has crept in through macrocosmic factors. While both microcosmic and the macrocosmic factors sustain through fear, the macrocosmic does not have much of an objective part to it. It is based a lot on shame. The fear of disappointing an imagined audience, be it parents, society, or followers, is what keeps us glued to these borrowed identities. This is hard to pivot, but eventually you will come to terms with your fragmented self, accept it, and start rebuilding. I personally feel that if we can stay clear of microcosmic idolization for most things in our lives, we can effectively avoid idolization of the macrocosmic nature. This is because being able to create from a point of purpose allows us to discover our true essence, a taste of our true potential, something which once savored cannot be overcome, either by the overlords of a system or some mesmerizing personality. And this is how you were meant to be, unfragmented and undivided, because you are not born to perform someone else's life. You were born to become someone who can no longer be compared. You were born to become yourself. Please like, share, and subscribe if you loved the content.